Here, it's my esteemed pleasure to introduce Dr. Coronel. He is an assistant professor in the School of Communication at The Ohio State University. He got his PhD with David at the University of Illinois and then held postdoctoral positions there and also at UPenn. Jason's research is broadly into questions relating to the practice of democracy. And in order to explore those topics, he brings a really remarkably wide range of tools, which means that he ends up publishing in a really wide range of journals. So he's to the study of the practice of democracy. He's bringing in ideas from trying to look at the psychological and even neurobiological underpinnings of political decision making. So that means that he could be publishing in communications journals or psychology journals or political science journals with really wide-ranging implications of his work. So we're lucky enough to have him telling us a little bit about that today with his research, with his talk titled "Using Eye Movements to Predict Large-Scale Voting Decisions in Direct Democracy Elections." So let's all thank Dr. Coronel and give him our attention, and generally save questions until the end. Probably clarifying questions are okay. But yeah, sound good, Jason?
That's great. So thank you, Ellie, for that introduction. So first, let me just generally thank everyone for inviting me to speak at your department. So I have to say, during the process of preparing for this talk, it brought back really fond memories of my time at the LSE. It was a very intellectually stimulating experience. And so I very much look forward to an intellectual conversation with you after my talk. So I am going to start by pointing out that a few months ago, there was an election in the United States. And when people usually think about elections, the first thing that usually comes to mind are the candidates running for office. So in the election that we had in the US last year, a lot of the international and national focus was on the candidates, the presidential candidates, in this case, Biden and Trump. This focus on the candidates actually gets reflected physically in the ballots that people use to cast their votes. So for example, here's what the California ballot looks like. The first thing that you see and the first thing that you're going to vote on as a voter are the candidates for president and vice president. But I think it's important to point out that elections are not just about voting for elected representatives. Some states practice a form of direct democracy where, in addition to the candidates, proposed laws are brought forth for a vote so that voters can vote directly on whether they want a particular law implemented or not implemented in their communities. So for example, in the same ballot from 2020 from the state of California, after you go through all the candidates, you encounter a series of proposed laws. So for instance, you have one that's asking whether the state should fund stem cell research. You have another one asking voters whether the state of California should use race as a criterion in terms of hiring people. You have another one asking voters whether they should strengthen consumer privacy laws within the state. And then you have another one that basically is asking whether local governments should have the power to impose rent controls within their communities. This form of direct democracy is not just limited to the state of California and the US, but in fact, in 2020, approximately 129 statewide ballot measures were put forth to voters across 34 states. And of course, this form of direct democracy is not just limited to the United States. Globally, approximately half the countries on the planet, so over 100, practice some form of direct democracy, either at the national or the subnational level. So it's a prominent, prevalent form of democratic institution. But over the last 20 years, there's been growing concern among members of the public and scholars that ballot measures, these proposed laws, are written in a way they're difficult to understand for voters. So you have instances of, as kind of reflected here, where voters and interest groups are basically concerned that these ballot measures are written in a way that they're confusing. They need to be written in plain language. And in every election, some interest group actually sues their state government based on this reason that ballot measures are confusing. So what are they talking about? What do they mean that ballot measures are confusing? So I think it's helpful to run through a specific actual example from last year. So what I'm going to show you is a ballot measure from the US state of Georgia. So 4.7 million voters in the state of Georgia voted on this ballot measure. So let me just read it out loud. Shall the act be approved which provides an exemption from ad valorem taxes for all real property owned by a purely public charity, if such charity is exempt from taxation under section 501c3 of the Federal Internal Revenue Code, and such real property is held exclusively for the purpose of building or repairing single-family homes, to be financed by such charity to individuals using loans that shall not bear interest. Okay, so two things to me at least stand out as to what potentially makes this difficult. For one is the use of legalistic and technical terms like ad valorem taxes, which I'm conjecturing most of the 4.7 million voters probably had no idea as to what that is. The other feature of this is the syntax, right? So this is one very long sentence with multiple clauses and a ton of ideas that's just crammed into one very long sentence. So because of the existence of these difficult to understand ballot measures, there's a body of scholarship looking at the potential influence of difficult to understand text on voting decisions. So how do difficulties in ballot comprehension on the part of the voter influence how they vote towards that ballot measure? And this is an important question to answer because politicians are often responsible for writing ballot measures. And there's a concern that they may accidentally or strategically and intentionally try to influence election outcomes just based on how they write the ballot language. So the work that I'm going to present to you makes several contributions to the direct democracy literature, and I'm just going to explicitly tell you what those contributions are. Like I'm just going to give it out front. So the first is I'm going to show you how you can use eye movements to measure the difficulties that voters experience while they're reading these ballot measures. So what are eye movements? How do you measure them? How do you go about using them to measure ballot comprehension difficulties? And why is this a contribution to the literature? So I'm going to spend the next few slides going over answers to those questions. So what are eye movements and how do you measure them? So this is the setup in my lab. So what you see is a participant, his head is on a head mount, looking at a screen, and the device that I've highlighted in red is the eye tracker. So what that does is it shines a very low level infrared light, so it's not visible to the naked eye. And in the lower left, you see that infrared light getting reflected out of his eyes, right? So that's the blue and the cyan color. So that infrared light gets reflected back into the device, and the device uses that information to estimate what the person is looking at on the screen. So here you can see that he's reading Macbeth, and so that red dot that's moving around is the estimate of his right eye. And so what you can immediately kind of get a sense is that eye tracking allows you to get a moment by moment kind of measure of people's reading performance, right? So at any given point in time, you will know what they're looking at on the screen. And so there's a vast literature on eye movements and reading, basically showing that eye movements can measure the ease or difficulty in which people read text. And one example of that is this finding that people are much more likely to look at words that are unfamiliar or difficult to understand. So what do I mean by that? So consider these two sentences. So the first one is the kind girl was feeding the sparrows. The second sentence is the kind girl was feeding the anhingas. Your average American will know what sparrows mean. So it's a bird, but they're not gonna know what anhingas mean, which is a type of South American bird. And so if you get one group of your average Americans to read the first sentence with sparrows, and then you get a different random group to read the second sentence, you are going to elicit different eye movement patterns. So something that looks like this. So the red circles are what are called fixations. So these are just moments when the eyes are paused very briefly. And the reason why they're paused is they're trying to extract information from the environment. So in this case, information from a word. And what you can see when you compare sparrows to anhingas is there are more fixations directed to anhingas, the unfamiliar word, than sparrows. So why is this contribution? Why is using eye movements to measure difficulties in ballot comprehension a contribution to the literature? So the current literature is dominated by readability formulas as a way of measuring difficulties in text. So things like the Fleisch-Kincaid readability tests, right? So the basic idea here is you take a passage of text, like a ballot measure, you calculate the number of words, sentences, and syllables, and you plug this into this equation, and it's going to output a score that's supposed to tell you how easy or hard it is for people to understand that passage of text. So one of the main limitations, however, of these readability formulas is they don't measure people's subjective experience while reading text. So for example, they're not going to differentiate individuals who know what ad valorem means from individuals who don't. Whereas eye movements, because they are a moment by moment measure of people's subjective psychological experiences, will. So that's the first contribution. So the second contribution kind of jumps off of that, where we're trying to establish that the types of psychological processes measured by eye movements in the lab can generalize to real world elections. So why is this a contribution? So there is a body of work within this direct democracy literature that have tried to study the psychological processes underlying voting decisions, and they do them in the context of the lab. And it remains an open question, the extent to which the types of processes that people are studying in the lab, whether they generalize to real world elections, and if they do, under what conditions do they actually generalize to real world elections. And so, so again, upfront, if you're asking about what is the unique contribution of the study, here they are in two sentences. So the studies that I'm going to present you in one way or the other ultimately is saying these two things. So I'm going to present two studies, both of which use eye tracking. So the study is currently in press in Psychological Science. And the global question that these studies are asking is, how do difficulties in ballot comprehension influence voting decisions? So the literature thus far have generated two hypotheses or two predictions about how what you would expect the answer is to these questions. So I'm just going to go through them because those are the hypotheses that we're actually testing in this study. So the first hypothesis is essentially, as ballot measures become difficult to understand, the rate of abstention will increase. So why would this be? So the general idea is that not being able to understand the substantive content of a ballot measure prevents voters from relating it to their own political preferences. And if you can't relate something to your own political preferences, you can't determine whether it's something that you should support or whether it's something that you should oppose. And if you can't determine it in terms of how it maps onto a directional vote, voters instead will choose to abstain, since they do have that option in the voting booth, that they'll just go, I don't know how this maps onto my preferences, I can't map this onto a directional vote. So I'll choose to abstain. The second prediction is that as ballot measures become more difficult to understand, the rate of opposition will increase. So the rate at which voters vote against instead of for the ballot measure. So in terms of the literature's explanation for this prediction, it's this. So they're starting off with the assumption that voters have a general aversion to risk and uncertainty. Difficult to understand ballot measures will elicit feelings of risk and uncertainty because you can't foresee or project the potential consequences of ballot measure since you don't know what it's essentially saying. So voters are assumed to know more about the status quo or the current state of affairs where the policy hasn't been implemented. And they're going to perceive changing the status quo as involving greater risk. So this is all to say that this creates a preference for the status quo. And given how most ballot measures are structured, at least in the US, where voting no means that you're rejecting the proposed policy, a vote no is essentially a vote to preserve the status quo. All right, so we're testing those two hypotheses. So before I get into the details, at the high level, let me just explain the logic of the research design. So the research design has two components to it. There is a lab component where we bring in a group of voters into the lab. We had them read ballot measures while we track their eyes. And then there's a real world election component where we're obtaining data, like voting data, from real world US elections. And one of the key ideas in the research design is we're gonna use ballot measures in the lab and we're gonna obtain voting data from real world elections such that essentially people in the lab and real world elections are reading the same ballot measures. And so what we're expecting is if the difficulties in comprehension measured by eye movements generalize from the lab to real world elections, then the eye movements that we obtained in the lab in response to these ballot measures should predict the real world voting decisions to the same ballot measures. So that is to say that as ballot measures become more difficult to understand, as indicated by eye movement measures in the lab, the proportion of real world abstention and the real world opposition rate for those same ballot measures should increase. So this is the entire logic of the research design at the very high level. So now let me just get through the actual details of how we went about implementing this. So we pre-registered 2 studies at the Open Science Framework. What this just means is that prior to data collection, we pre-registered or committed to the hypotheses, the number of lab participants that we were gonna run, our stimuli selection procedure, our research design, and our statistical analysis plan. Study 1 uses what I'm referring to as a post-election design. What does this mean? What this means is that we collected the lab data after the real world elections have already transpired. So for example, for the lab study, we brought people in from July to September of 2008 or 2018. But in terms of the data, the real world voting data that we used, we obtained them from elections that occurred approximately at most 6 years prior. So the 2012 and 2014 US elections. So we selected 40 ballot measures, real ones, from 21 states. So this does not include Ohio. And collectively, the 40 ballot measures elicited approximately 63 million votes. And then in the lab study, we recruited 120 registered voters from Ohio, half men, half women. The average age was 35. And here's the distribution of their self-identified party affiliation. So what you can just see here is they're mostly Democrats, or the majority of them are Democrats. So study 2 uses a pre-election design. So what do I mean by that? So in this case, the lab data was collected before the elections actually transpired. So in this case, the lab study was conducted from July to November 2nd of 2018. And then the real world voting data was obtained from the November 6th, 2018 election. So the real world voting data was obtained after essentially we were done with collecting the lab study. So here we selected 24 ballot measures from 11 states, again, not Ohio, and this one collectively elicited about 74 million votes. For the lab study, there were 120 registered voters from Ohio, again, half men, half women, average age is 64. And again, a little so 61, again, half of the sample consisted of Democrats. All right, so how did we go about selecting in total the 64 ballot measures? We started actually with a database of about 500 ballot measures. How did we narrow it down to 64? So our overarching goal, which pretty much determined the rules that we set for the stimuli selection procedure, was this. Our goal was to increase the likelihood that people in the lab in the real world elections had no knowledge of the ballot measures. This was our way of trying to equate the two groups of in terms of their baseline knowledge of the ballot measures. That is, the baseline knowledge being little to no knowledge about the ballot measures. So in order to do this, we selected ballot measures that were primarily low salience issues. So what do I mean by that? So ballot measures that gained no paid advertising, so campaign advertising at the time of selection. They did not receive extensive news coverage, so very little to no news coverage. So we did internet searches essentially to check for this. And we intentionally excluded high salience issues. So issues that voters are likely going to have very strong prior attitudes about, and ones that they likely know a lot about. So in the context of the US, issues like abortion, gun control, immigration are highly controversial. People have very strong feelings about them, and people know a lot about them. So these types of issues were excluded from the selection. So if you institute these rules, what you're usually left with are issues most related to things like state and local government, infrastructure projects, and the state budget. Just as a quick note, I would not equate low salience with the idea that these issues are not important in the everyday lives of voters. I mean, you know, in the United States, 90% of the laws that we live under are at the subnational level, not national, like at the level of the state. So it's actually important with respect to what powers you're giving to your state government. And infrastructure projects pertain to questions like, how do schools or how do highways or waterworks get funded into your communities? And then once we've narrowed it down to low salience issues, we then selected ballot measures that varied in the amount of familiar and unfamiliar words. So how did we go about doing that? So we had to essentially determine how often the words contained in these ballot measures occurred in everyday language. So how did we go about doing that? So we calculated the word frequency for each word. So essentially, there's this database called Subtlex US, which is a database of words. It has like a database of subtitles that are used in shows in movies in the United States. So it's like a database of 8,000 shows. And what we did was we determined how frequently each of these words appeared in that database. So for example, the term ad valorem does not appear at all in the database, whereas the term property, you get this estimate of 33 words per 1 million words in the corpus. So the assumption that we're going in is that low frequency words like ad valorem are likely going to be less familiar to people since they don't appear in everyday English language use, whereas property, which is relatively more frequent, is likely going to be much more familiar. So what we did is after we calculated the word frequency for all the words, we estimated a median word frequency for each ballot measure, and then we selected them such that about half the ballot measures had a low median word frequency, meaning that it's relatively difficult to understand, and then the other half had high median word frequency, meaning that it's relatively easy to understand. So in terms of the structure of the lab study, this is what one trial looks like. So we had participants read a ballot measure one at a time on the screen. They had complete control over the amount of time that they read this. When they're done, they press a button, and then we asked them to make one of three decisions, to either abstain, support, or oppose. The reason we had them do this is we wanted to simulate what the experience was like in the actual voting booth. That is to say, you're reading not just for the sake of reading, but you're reading for the sake of you're going to render a voting decision about the proposed law that you're reading. And so what I'm going to show you in the next two slides is just a video of what an example of what one trial from one participant looks like, and you'll see their eye movements. So it's going to be a red dot that's moving around the screen. Okay. All right, so here's another way of representing the data where you have the fixations superimposed over the text. And so we had different measures of eye movements, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to talk about one of them. So the average number of first pass fixations, what are those? That's just the average number of fixations that a word elicits when people first encounter the word. So the heuristic to use is more first pass fixations equals essentially people are having a much more difficult time understanding or figuring out what the word means. So in terms of our pre-registered analysis plan, we estimated several regression models. The critical independent variable, so I'm only showing you one in this study, is the amount of first pass fixations for each ballot measure. So this was collected again in lab. And the critical dependent variables, there are two. So the rate of real world abstention rate, so how many voters in the real world abstained from voting for that particular ballot measure, and the rate of real world opposition. So the proportion of voters in the real world that voted for instead of, voted against instead of for the ballot measure. And we also pre-registered three classes in general of covariates. So properties of the real world ballot measures. So for example, the order that they appeared in the real world ballot. Demographic characteristics of the lab participants. So for instance, their level of political knowledge, how much they know about politics. And then we pre-tested the ballot measures using a different group of participants to first confirm that they were in fact different from the high salience issues. And so we also had metrics relating to perceived familiarity and perceived importance. So first, I'm going to show you the results from the post-election design. So study one. So to just remind everyone, so as ballot measures become more difficult to understand, the rate of abstention will increase. So before I show you the results, let me just orient you to this graph. So on the x-axis, you have the average number of first pass fixations. So the interpretation here is the more you have these, the more the ballot is harder to understand. So as this value increases, the ballot is harder to understand. And on the y-axis, you have the real-world abstention rate. So here it's ranging from about 12% to 16%. So the proportion of voters who opted not to vote for the ballot measure. And as predicted, what you see is this positive relationship, whereas essentially as difficulty in understanding the ballot increases, so too does the real-world abstention rate. So if you look at the beta, that's 0.02, so meaning that a 1 fixation increase corresponds to a 2% increase in the abstention rate. All right, next, H2, hypothesis 2. So as ballot measures become more difficult to understand, the rate of opposition will increase. So here again, on the x-axis, you have average number of first pass fixations. The y-axis has now changed to the real-world opposition rate, which is the proportion of voters who voted against as opposed to for the ballot measure. And again, as predicted, as ballot measures become more difficult to understand, the real-world opposition rate also increases. So here, a 1 fixation increase corresponds to about a 3% increase in voters voting no against the ballot measure. All right, so now I'm going to go through the results from the pre-election design, study 2. So I learned one important lesson with respect to pre-election designs that might be useful for individuals who are planning on employing similar types of design. And that is this, that essentially unexpected events that you did not plan for will happen. So for example, when we selected the ballot measures months prior to the election, we selected all of them such that they received no campaign advertising. But by the time the election actually transpired, approximately three of them received paid campaign advertising. So they were publicized. Next, again, when we selected the ballot measures, they had no media coverage. But by the time that the election happened, about 20% of them received extensive local news coverage. So what this just means is that we, in some ways, also had to deviate from our pre-registered analysis plan to account for these events that we did not plan for. So the way that was implemented is that we added them as covariates. So things like whether a covariate for whether a ballot measure did in fact receive or did not receive campaign advertisement. So what I'm going to show you are the results of two analyses. So what do the results look like when you stick to the pre-registered model? And then what do the results look like when you use the model that accounts for these unexpected events? So starting with the abstention results, we did not find a statistically robust relationship if you stick to the pre-registered model between difficulty in ballot measure comprehension and the real world abstention rate. Whereas if you use a model that adds all of these unexpected events as covariates, you find the statistical relationship in the predicted direction between eye movements and the real world abstention rate. So one interpretation of this is, I don't want to make too strong about it, but that those do matter. The fact that the real world voters likely learned a lot about some of the ballot measures. Okay, so what does the opposition results look like? So if you stick to the pre-registered model, you see this predicted relationship. And then if you do the model accounting for the unexpected events, you still see this predicted relationship. And here, if you look at the betas, they don't seem to change much. So it didn't seem to have mattered, at least as much for the opposition results. All right, so overall summary. so what did we essentially find? So the evidence that I presented to you is consistent with the claim that difficulties in ballot comprehension can influence voting decisions. So that's consistent with what the literature has found. But the unique contribution of this study is primarily the second one, where we're showing that eye movement responses from the lab can predict real world voting decisions. And to just remind everybody, this is a relatively small number of participants predicting essentially voting decisions constituting millions of people. And I'd also like to highlight, so something that I think a lot about is we observe this relationship between eye movements and real world voting decisions, despite a variety of contextual and sample differences between the lab and the real world election. So for example, in the lab, the participants saw 40 or 24 ballots, which is actually relatively a lot compared to what they typically would vote on in the United States, where people in the voting booth, with the exception of probably California, see far fewer. So in the lab, we collected the data not on election day, whereas the real world votes are usually done in the information and emotional environment of election day. In the lab, the participants knew that their choices were being observed, whereas in a real world election, the choices are anonymous. And then there are also sample differences, which in the lab, we had more Democrats than Republicans. In real world elections, distribution of those two groups tend to be more equal. But despite these contextual and sample differences, we're still observing this association between eye movements recorded in the lab and real world voting decisions. So in terms of broader implications, I think there are two. So I think this is consistent with some of the issues that's been raised by both scholars and members of the public, that it raises the concern that people have had about direct democracy. That being that people can likely get influenced not by the substantive content of the ballot measure itself, but how it's essentially written. And I think in the long run, at least for at least my field and the area that I work on, the foundational study essentially lays the groundwork for using eye movements to study the consequences of ballot language on voting decisions. So in terms of current and future directions, there are essentially two projects that we're working on. So one is we're doing a study where we now disentangle word familiarity from syntactic complexity. And we're also now going to experimentally and exogenously manipulate things like word familiarity so that we can guarantee that the increases in eye movements directed to the word is really a function of people not knowing the meaning of that particular word. And then although the studies here, since it's foundational, focused on low salience issues, we're planning on extending this to look at the high salience issues and the extent to which the effects that we observe here also replicate and extend when you get into the realm of high salience issues. First, I also want to just acknowledge the entire team of graduate students and faculty that's involved in this project. So the grad students are Olivia, Matt, and Shannon, and the faculty are Hillary and Rob. And so they're a great group of colleagues to work with, and we've been working on this project for 2 years, and it's likely that we're going to work on together on several iterations of this in the next few years as well. And so that's it. If you are interested in other papers using eye tracking in the social sciences, of how it can be used to answer substantive questions in the social sciences, please visit this website. So I'm only actually showing you the surface of what you can use eye movements for. So if you're interested in other applications, please go to that website. And incidentally, that's also my lab website. So I'm ending with a plug to to my work. Anyway, thank you, and I look forward to discussing my research with you.
Thank you very much, Jason. Okay, so happy for any questions. If you can't ask them yourselves, you can write it in the chat and I can relay. But if you can, Mick, you want to go ahead?
Okay, yeah, I think this is a question that's going to be more relevant for the subsequent work for higher status issues than for this one. I'm wondering whether, to what extent you interacted partisanship of the respondent or the subject with the decision that they made, because you did have a quite unbalanced partisanship in the group. And I'm thinking that probably those measures, some of them are going to be Republican measures, some of them are going to be Democratic measures, and that people are going to react differently depending on how they code the partisanship of the measure. Now, if you say, well, people had no idea about what these measures were beforehand, that may not be an issue. But as soon as you talk about issues which people have heard of, it will be.
No, I completely agree. And as we plan for those studies, that is actually one of the challenges, because I completely agree with you that in the high salience issues now, I do think the sample differences matter, and that the distribution of Democrats and Republicans in the lab, I think, needs to match the distribution of whatever states we're using to make out of sample predictions from, precisely because for the high salience issues, there's going to be baseline differences in knowledge and prior attitudes that's going to correlate with people's partisan ID. So I think if what we're trying to do is replicate study one, in which we find similar associations between increases in language difficulty in voting, I think we would have to match for sample differences. And that's challenging because it was a lot easier to do that in study one, since we did not theoretically expect these partisan differences to matter. And so we could just use a whole body of states. Whereas now we might even just get restricted to using a handful of states where we know the distribution of Democrats and Republicans. So yeah, if any of you have ideas of how to efficiently do that, of if one can do it beyond just expanding one state, I'd be happy to hear those thoughts.
So if I can jump in there, I have one immediate response to that, which is, first of all, with what you're suggesting there, that's assuming that people who identify as Democrats in Ohio, assuming that's where you're getting your sample from, are the same or will respond the same to people who identify as Democrats in Massachusetts or California or Texas, which may actually be very different. So what my question was, more generally then, was going to be, if you try to explain some of the variation in perceived difficulty of the different ballot measures using information that you have that would be sort of socio-demographic and including party affiliation, as was just mentioned. Because if there are consistent differences in the ability with which people process these votes, and if we can see that you're talking about essentially at some level almost disenfranchisement, it's not quite that, that's maybe too strong of a term, but taking away people's ability to actually vote their preference or their informed choice then. And if that's differentially affecting people of different backgrounds or party choices, then that it's kind of profound, right? So have you tried to look in any way at explaining some of the differences between subjects and their fixation rates and things like that based on the demographic information that you have?
So the answer is no. So we haven't looked at that, again, precisely because we calibrated the study to just look at this of one particular basic question in mind that's foundational. But I will say that, like, to your point though, that is one of the strengths of eye movements, is that you can actually now begin to look at individual differences and variations in people's differential subjective experiences for these ballot measures, which you cannot get with the readability formulas. So that's, I think that's more towards future work that is to some degree encapsulated by our attempts to extend this into the high salience issues and looking at differences now between Democrats and Republicans and potentially even individuals with differing levels of political knowledge.
Other questions? I've got another one. Okay, go ahead, Nick. We'll just alternate.
This is just for information, really, because I'm sure this is published and I just don't know it. What is the relationship between these eye tracking measurements and the readability scores? I'm thinking for people who don't have access to eye trackers, who were forced to use something that they can get much more easily. So how closely do they correlate?
So looking at our own data, we have found the association that you would expect, where as the readability scores indicate that something gets harder, you find this association where the eye movements track it. However, what I would like to point out, so something that I didn't emphasize here is the advantage of eye movements over readability scores, in addition to what I just mentioned, is that if you're interested in identifying what level of text is actually eliciting the difficulties, whether it's a specific word, a phrase, a sentence, or the entire text, you can't do that with, so if you're globally interested, then yes, you can use readability scores. But if you're interested in the specific level that's causing the difficulty, I would recommend that you use eye movements, since they're ideal for answering those types of questions.
No, I mean, I absolutely get the point about eye movements, and I can't see why you wouldn't do it if you had access to the technology, but a lot of people don't. And a lot of people are dealing with different sorts of text where they just have the text and that something in order to rest. I mean, what would be interesting, I don't know if anyone who's done this, would be to kind of support the readability scores against the eye movement scores and look at the residuals, because really what you're saying is it's the residuals that are interesting. It's where one doesn't predict the other that's interesting.
That's a great idea.
Whether you can characterize the residuals, like, is it in Latin, for example, if you're taking ad valorem or whatever?
No, that's a great idea. Something I haven't thought about. Yes, but thank you.
Do you know, I'm trying to think in my most recent ballots, you can often get them in multiple languages. Are there differences, and have you looked into differences in readability for like a US ballot in English versus the Spanish versions of it? Or other languages, you know, are the translations of what should be the same text equally difficult to read?
There is work on that, and we actually have a study ongoing looking at bilingual voters and whether they prefer, as indicated by their eye movements, to look at, let's say, the English version. In this case, it's going to be the Spanish version. Previous work looking at readability scores essentially indicate that they're equally worse, or equally as bad as the English version, largely from, so some of the case studies that have looked at this, it's a function of, you know, not having kind of good enough translators to convert the English to the Spanish version. And so, yeah, like this is going to be like another avenue of research that we're looking at, that we expect the same kind of effects when you move into the domain of different languages. And I should also add that this relationship between eye movements and, let's say, they look longer at words that they don't understand, that generalizes across different populations and different languages. So for instance, you see the same pattern in German, Chinese, Spanish. So again, eye movements are ideal for studying these relationships in other languages that it's not just in English.
Go ahead, Alia.
Okay. Thanks so much for the presentation. I'm curious, I just want to follow up on Mick's question earlier. And I'm curious, it sounds like one of the key contributions you're making is really getting into specifics of where the lack of understanding is arising, right? In like specific kind of ballots or whatever. For your work, is this, I mean, is one of the things you're interested in doing, like then basically making policy prescriptions, because that's the one place I can see that this would be useful. I mean, besides kind of adding to more specific knowledge that, you know, let's not use these legalese terms, let's make syntax clearer. Is that like is that something you're interested in with this research?
Yes, so in the long run, that is the ultimate goal. And so we're actually partnered with this organization called Ballotpedia. So incidentally, they're also the ones that provide, they're a non-interest nonprofit group. So you can look them up. They mainly focus on US elections, but one of the things that they do is they provide people information about the ballots that are coming up in upcoming elections. And they're so that people can use that information to inform their voting decisions. And we've expressed kind of an agreement with them about how we are going to share with them some of the potential suggestions of how ballot measures can be written in an easier way. So yeah, so in the long run, yeah, our goal is to basically promulgate the more translational practical applications of research coming from this.
And I just want to follow up on that. Like, I mean, you're studying this in the context, obviously, of voting, which is super important. But I mean, I can recount numerous instances when in my own life, I have to kind of, you know, check box, basically like super legalese stuff to kind of get access to things. I mean, how do you think this research has implications for that? Because I mean, I sort of think it's ridiculous to expect someone to read like 5 pages of something just to access a website or whatever. And I mean, I do it, and I'm a relatively educated person who does not understand most of what I'm reading, and then I skim it. And I wonder if you, I guess what your thoughts are on, like, you know, this kind of wording, this kind of language when it's used outside of voting, like, does it, I mean, I think it matters for privacy. I'm just curious about what you think.
Oh, completely. So this concern about the use of, let's just call it legalistic language, extends beyond voting. So in the United States, for example, I mean, people have complained about contracts, right? That they're reading them in a way that you can't understand. There's work as well on trying to turn jury instructions in a way that's more palatable to people in juries, because they're also written in legalistic language. That is to say, there's actually a very big movement in the United States from interest groups called the Plain Language Movement, who's advocating for precisely this, of revising all of these legalistic documents such that they're actually comprehensible to the average person who's reading them. So yeah, it very much applies to all of these domains, and you can very much, I mean, since it's text is text, you can use eye movements to also study the effects of legalistic language in these various domains.
Go ahead, Ivan.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I thought that was really interesting, in particular because I'm from Switzerland, so direct democracy is something that, you know, is quite salient for me. And my first question is just an ignorant one, which is, besides, you know, public discourse around whatever the ballot might be, does the government provide any kind of information other than what you see, right? So for your low salience, your ballot, which people don't know much about, is there any extrinsic information provided or not? And if there isn't, I was going to say, maybe it might be interesting to consider a comparison with what happens in Switzerland, where every time you receive these ballots, which have these really complicated legalese, terms, you also receive a small booklet produced by the government, which contains the government's recommendations, weirdly enough, because it's Swiss, the recommendations of people in favor and the recommendations of people against it. So I was just wondering, it's more about, have you considered international comparison, and would that help you look at specifically this kind of effect?
So the answer to the first question is, in terms of actual laws requiring additional information, there's variation across the subnational units at the level of the states. So for instance, some states require a plain language explanation that you get the original one, and then right below it is presumably the easier to understand version. Whereas some states do something like a fiscal impact statement, where they don't give you an easier to understand version, but they just tell you whether it's going to cost the state, how much implementing a ballot measure is going to how much it's going to cost the state. So I can imagine your idea is a great design where you might not even have to do international comparisons if you're trying to vary the information provided, that you can just do it within potentially the subnational units in the United States. And so, yeah, and what I would predict is the more information essentially that you give people, the less likely ballot language is going to exert an effect on voting decisions, because you just have more competition with respect to the various pieces of information that people could be using.
Isaac, please.
Thanks. Thanks so much for this talk. This was really interesting. I kind of had a question, which is like, I guess, thinking from a sort of like, what is the purpose of direct democracy perspective, right? Like you can imagine there's maybe two problems. One is like, someone reads this thing and they don't understand what it actually means, right? So this kind of technical uncertainty. But there might be another example of like, maybe like a normative uncertainty, like one of the examples you gave about sort of using race in government hiring in the California ballot example, right? My understanding is that there's like decent evidence that suggests how you ask that question actually really shapes how people answer it, whether you call it affirmative action versus sort of race-based hiring or whatever. And so I guess I'm kind of curious if you think there's ways to distinguish between this kind of normative uncertainty versus this more sort of technical uncertainty, as well as almost like, how do we know whether sort of one is a bigger question than the other, or a bigger problem, so to speak?
I'm sorry, could you please rephrase your question about normative uncertainty? I didn't quite understand it.
I guess the way I would interpret the kind of data that suggests that like people respond to questions about race-based hiring differently based on how you ask the question might sort of suggest that maybe just like people kind of just don't have a very strong set, like a very sort of set understanding as to how to think about that question, right? There are some cases in which they think it is totally legit to use race. Sometimes they think
got it.
Right.
So one interpretation of what you just said is that if people have these psychological biases, where depending on how you write these ballot measures, that you can manipulate, in this case, the ballot writer can manipulate their voting decisions, right? Whether you say race-based or ethnic-based, that even that small difference, it kind of gets this more global question of whether people have true preferences that they're expressing via their vote, or whether it's manipulable. My interpretation of what you're asking, ultimately from a normative perspective, is should we have direct democracy if people's political preferences are so malleable as a function of ballot language? Like, is that what you're asking?
I guess in my view, maybe it'd be like if the issue is like people have preset ideas, but they just don't know how to translate that because of the sort of language of the ballot measure itself, then the policy prescription there is like plain language requirements, right? But there are perhaps other issues in which they simply lack a sort of set preference. And so I guess what I'm trying to understand is sort of like, if we might be able to figure out how to distinguish one from the other, or maybe those aren't distinguishable. Maybe this is kind of a dumb way of thinking, and I apologize if it is.
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, it's something, I mean, the normative component of this is the one that's underlying all of this work. It's kind of like, it wasn't explicitly stated here, but it's something that I often think about as to, you know, it gets at the issue of vote, at least what they call in the literature, voter competence. And do people know enough? Do they know enough of what they need to know in a democracy? So for one normative argument, like what you said, is that if we subscribe to a view of democracy, wherein we expect voters to be heavily involved in the process, in things like this, like direct democracy, then yes, it makes sense that we should be doing our best to make them informed about the ballot measures, and providing them with information and making sure that it's written in a way that it's easy to understand. If you subscribe to a view of democracy in which you think voters should be heavily involved. But as you know, that's not the only view, right, of democracy. Some people view, like the founders of the United States, which they think that it's should completely be like a representative form of democracy, where voters are insulated directly from the policy, they're insulated for the most part from the policy-making process, and you should just leave that up to elected representatives. But I agree with you. Under that view of democracy, then it makes sense that that's what what the state governments should be doing.
Mick, did you have a further question?
Oh, sorry, you're muted.
Sorry, I cede my time to anyone else on something. But I mean, I think the policy question is an interesting one. So I'm kind of thinking of the Brexit referendum here, or the Scottish referendum on Scottish independence, where the claim after the event turned into a disaster was basically that people didn't know what they were voting for. And the reason that they didn't know what they were voting for, it was claimed, is that the proposal was not specific enough. It was just kind of general thing, and then everything had to be sorted out after the event. And so I think the tension is going to be, I mean, the lawyers are going to say that if you're going to vote on a ballot measure that is going to have a legal effect, that people have to see the legal text. They have to see, do you want to implement this, yes or no? And if you just say, you know, do you want to have abortion or do you want to have independence, then nobody really knows what's involved in that. It seems to me that the eye tracking thing has a possibility that you could, if you got into the policy process and you were putting a referendum or a ballot measure to the public, that you could, as it were, get a team of lawyers. It's maybe very ambitious, and you could try and simplify. You could start off with a complex legal text, you know, score it, and then keep trying to simplify it to a point at which the lawyers were still happy that it was precise enough to tell people what they were voting for, but you'd lowered the tracking score as low as you possibly could. And it seems to me that that would be a very useful policy and implementation of what you're doing.
Oh, absolutely. And so to just add to that, for instance, so when I mentioned that the state of Massachusetts experimented with something that you just said, but in the case of the jury instructions. So that is to say, they actually got a group of judges, lawyers, and linguists, where they worked on the jury instructions collectively so that each group is satisfied. As you mentioned, that the lawyers were satisfied with the legal kind of implications, and the linguists were satisfied that this is going to be comprehensible. And they pre-tested them with real people so that they actually ended up with a document that that satisfied the legal and the comprehensibility concerns from different groups. So yeah, I completely agree that I think that's a great idea. and that eye tracking could potentially aid in attempts by these different groups of doing that. As far as I know, nobody has done it, at least in the US, at the level of these ballot measures, has done anything like that.
I mean, I think what eye tracking is adding, as I understand it, is over and above the kind of comprehensibility scores. It's telling you word by word, if you want to go through a document word by word, which are the words that people aren't understanding.
Yep, exactly. Yep, exactly.
Opportunity to think of any final questions. I've got one last one here, which is, yeah, I sort of like the your open science, plight there of having the. I mean, first of all, good on you for taking the right approach there, but then also having the. I mean, what becomes just a clean marker of the effect of circulating information about ballot measures on. Presumably what that means. I mean, I would guess you could probably go into ballot by ballot levels, but you would hope then that your ability to predict the outcome for the ballot measures that were the ones that had news coverage and whatever else would be decidedly less good than your performance on the ones where people didn't have as much information. And, I was just, when I've had to, do this as well, what I always do before I vote is I try to look to see what the League of Women Voters has said, and I try to find outside information, and I often don't even bother to read the official legalese version of it because I know I'm not going to understand, or it's been written by committee to such an extent that it's not, as you said, it's not clear how it aligns with my political leanings. So it seems like there's an interesting opportunity there to look directly at, again, your ability to predict things based on the available information that's circulating out there, whether through media coverage or through, my local newspaper has suggested that, this is how you should vote on these different positions. Or I was frustrated. I got my absentee ballot early enough that like the local newspaper hadn't yet given its view to tell me how to vote. Right? I wanted the guidance on how to vote, but I couldn't take. I had to actually try to process through this sort of stuff. You could also imagine then differences in abstention rates or something like that as you're further out from the election because people don't have the additional information to discuss things like that. Anyway, I was wondering if you're going to be looking in a more granular way, not just what I was talking about before at variation between voters, but also at variations between ballot measures and their relative coverage and the relative information that might be circulating about them.
Yes, I mean, what you mentioned is something that I've thought a lot about and have tried to approach in multiple ways, right? So the absentee issue that you mentioned is, it's something that we can't disaggregate in the present data that we have, but to just give you a sense, 20% on average of the votes are absentee. So the question that we don't know is how much of those absentee ballots are ones in which people actually went to the internet and looked up. That we don't know. Something that's related to this is we have done this this survey on a nationally representative sample where I was just curious to see of people who are in the voting booth, how many of them have actually taken out their cell phones, since smartphones now are dominant. And when you encounter either a candidate or an issue that you know nothing about, that you just take it out in the voting booth and you look it up. So right now, according to that data that we have, it's about 5% of voters take it out. So those are the various ways that we've tried to get at this harder issue of how do you determine whether people are looking up? How do you gain an accurate estimate of people looking up information about these ballot measures?
Talia, did you want to wrap us up with the final question, unless there are any others in the wings?
Yeah, I mean, I had like a broader question, which is a little bit personal. So, but I'm going to ask it and then you can decide to not answer it if you don't want to, which is just like, this is, you laid out very clearly why this research matters for contributing to, discussions around direct democracy. I'm just curious about like how this fits in with your broader research agenda. How is this the problem or the research question that you decided to zoom in on?
Like more globally, this idea of, based on your conceptions of, let's say, democracy, and in me, it's like one of the ingrained conceptions of democracy is that people should be involved and actively involved in public affairs. That requires a ton of assumptions that you have to make about people, that they are actually interested in being involved in public affairs, and two, that they know a lot about politics in order to make informed decisions that are aligned with their political preferences. So in terms of the deep interest, it's those questions about, in this case, in the context of the United States, do American voters possess the characteristics that you have to assume is true if you have this conception of democracy where people are heavily involved in public affairs? So this is where this and a lot of my other work ultimately stem from. It's like I said with the question, it's normative actually in nature. It's normatively at its core, normatively motivated.
Ivan, one final question for us, then we can release Jason to the.
Sorry, it's really simple and basic, but I think it's so cool that you're predicting sort of real world results, right? And I wanted to ask about the slopes that you've reported. Probably, I didn't read the graph probably, but between a sort of minimally complicated ballot, so one where there's very few fixations, and a maximally one where you see a lot of things, how much of an actual effect does that predict for you, roughly? I'm just wondering, is that a jump in 10% more absentee?
Great question.
What's the?
Yeah, it's around, so they're relatively small effects. So an increase of one fixation corresponds to something like, in the opposition rate, something like between 3 or 6%. Now, so two things to mention about that. The first one being is that, so in our data set of 500 or so ballot measures, approximately 10% of them won with a margin of victory between 1 and 5%. So even these small differences can matter in highly competitive elections. And the second thing to point out with respect to those effects is that those are actually plausible estimates of what you would expect, right? Because in real world voter decisions, there's so many factors that go in to why people vote. So of course you would expect things like changes in language to have relatively small effects overall.
No, absolutely. But what you just said is important because it shows the sort of importance of the practical effect, right? There's something at stake. I don't know. I just thought that helped me. Yeah.
Well, on that note of understanding the importance of what Jason has shown us today, let's thank him one more time for an excellent talk.